Our next speaker is Dr. Jason Sawyer, and we're going to he's unfortunately not been able to travel in person, and so we're going to see if we can spool him in for a virtual presentation from afar. And Jason was raised in and around Central Texas, and his family has deep roots there, and the family place still in McCulloch County. He received his bachelor's degree in rangeland ecology and ranch management from Texas A&M University in 1995. He has a master's of science degree in ruminant nutrition and a PhD in range nutrition and beef cattle management in 2000, both from New Mexico State University here in Las Cruces. Following that, Dr. Sawyer joined the faculty at the Clayton Livestock Research Center in Clayton, New Mexico, the joint appointment in research and extension programming as a beef cattle extension specialist. He joined the faculty at Texas A&M in 2003 with teaching and research roles in beef cattle production, focusing on beef cattle nutrition and stocker cattle production management. In 2008, he assumed the role of superintendent of the McGregor Research Center, overseeing an integrated crop and livestock operation with approximately 1,200 beef cows, stocker, grow yard, and finishing enterprises, as well as facilitating research programs related to beef cattle production and management, while continuing to teach and conduct research in beef cattle production systems and related areas. And I think during that period of times when I first met Jason, that Bruce Carpenter had both of us on a program out in West Texas. And, so known Jason a long time. Jason joined the team at the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management in January of 2020 to expand the opportunities for the Institute to create innovative solutions for ranch management. His primary interests are in the development of strategies to enhance sustainability of beef production systems, the application of nutritional strategies on those systems, and development of valid indicators of sustainable production. Jason's authored or co-authored over 75 peer-reviewed publications, over 200 abstracts and proceedings, and technical reports, and given over 100 presentations at local, state, and national meetings. Please help me welcome Jason, and we'll look forward to your comments.
Thanks for the invitation to speak, and I deeply regret that I'm not there in person. I was very much looking forward to getting back to Las Cruces and have an opportunity to visit with a bunch of folks, and so I apologize for my remote presentation, but I appreciate the help, I guess, with still being able to make the presentation. And so you've already heard from the previous two speakers quite a bit about the notion of climate neutral beef. And so what I'd like to visit with you a little bit about today are pathways that might lead to that outcome. And we're going to jump right in, and there we go. All right. And so as you've already heard today, warming is really the greatest expressed concern related to climate. Now, the challenge is that we often also intermix that with the notion of carbon in the atmosphere, because the hypothesis is that warming is related to increases in atmospheric greenhouse gases, most of which are carbon-containing compounds. And so we tend to use these terms interchangeably, but that leads to some confusion. I mean, again, the general hypothesis here is that if sources of carbon or greenhouse gas emissions are greater than the sinks available for those gases, then that results in atmospheric accumulation. That accumulation changes the Earth energy balance and leads to warming. And so that concern has grown from perhaps just sort of vocal or academic concerns or expressions of concern to much more substantial action, particularly within markets. And what I'm showing here is a graph of quote unquote sustainable investing allocation in the United States over the past 35 years or so. But notice the steep increases, particularly in the last 10 years. And notably after 2020, this pace has actually accelerated, although not shown on the graph. Importantly, if we look at where those funds are being allocated, of what ESG criteria are important to money managers, you can see that climate change and carbon related issues dominate the allocation practice or strategy of money managers. And in particular, I'd like you to look there at the sustainable natural resources and agriculture component, which while it has pretty equivalent share to several other areas of ESG investing strategy, if you look at the percentage increase in assets affected over just the last few years, you can see that that number has almost doubled during that period of time. And so certainly there has been movement, and that concern, I guess, and the responses expressed in the financial world manifest themselves in pledges and claims by corporate actors. And those are also driven in part by policy changes. And I've put some examples of those things from here in the US on the right-hand side of the slide. And so while certainly there's a great deal of momentum around this issue, as has also been brought up this morning, the terms can be confusing. Are we trying to be climate positive, carbon neutral, or zero something? And so just as kind of a quick definition check here, let's agree that climate neutrality implies a system with minimal effect on projected global temperature change. In other words, a system that can perhaps remove as many quote unquote warming equivalents as it emits would have no effect or no measurable effect on projected warming. The idea here is that a system like that would serve to maintain or even reduce the radiative trapping in the atmosphere. A carbon neutral system, on the other hand, by definition, would remove as much carbon from the atmosphere as it emits. But that exchange of carbon atoms could have either no effect on warming at all. It could reduce warming. It could even reverse warming. Or again, it could not affect the rate of warming in any way, because the carbon atoms themselves are part of molecules, and those molecules aren't necessarily fungible with regard to their atmospheric activity. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And then sometimes you hear zero emission systems, and zero emission systems would imply that no carbon emissions of any kind are generated, and candidly, that's just not a realistic biological system. And so we're going to spend our time here thinking about pathways toward climate neutrality within the US BIF system. And so we're going to start off here with a slide that everybody's probably familiar with. In the red series here is the US beef inventory. And so this is total beef cattle in the US from 1920 to 2021. And as we can see, the peak load or peak inventory of beef cattle occurred in the mid-1970s and has been followed by a fairly steep decline. And over the last 20 years or so, oscillations, perhaps modest decreases in total inventory. The gray series represents total methane emissions, and it's labeled here total EPA because these emissions were estimated according to the EPA methodology for greenhouse gas inventory reporting. This would be a tier 2 type system according to the IPCC. And as you can see here, over the last, say, 30 years or so, the emissions rate has diverged from the cattle inventory. This would imply that there are more emissions per animal in that time period. If we kind of zoom in on that series, and so this is the same data, just zoomed in a little bit. I'm showing it here from 1980 to 2020. Those are actual data. And then from 2020 to 2050, using a projection of the US inventory that shows oscillation, typical cyclical oscillation in the inventory, but without any mean increase or decrease. So this would suppose that the inventory has reached stability. And then we can see the projected methane emissions that result from inventory levels in that range over the next 30 years. Now, as we go forward from this slide on, the scaling is going to stay the same. In each slide, we'll have a series that overlaps. In other words, there should be a reference series on each slide so we can kind of keep track of what we're doing here. On this, the gray dots, again, represent methane emissions, the same emissions that were shown on the prior slide in gray. I've just rescaled the slide. So now they look really small down close to the axis. And again, that represents the methane emissions from US beef inventory over the time span displayed. But of course, greenhouse gas emissions aren't limited to methane. And so the mass of non-methane emissions associated with US beef production to the farm gates. So this is prior to processing, right? So this is walking into the back door of the packing facility. Those non-methane emissions represented as carbon dioxide equivalents are displayed in blue. And as you can see on a mass basis, the non-methane emissions are substantially greater than the methane emissions. However, there is a tendency, as Rory indicated, to wish to create quote unquote equivalencies so that multi-gas scenarios can be evaluated with a single equivalence metric. The metric of choice over the last 10 or 15 years has evolved to be the global warming potential over a 100-year horizon. We'll talk just a bit more about that in a moment. I think you're all familiar with this. The GWP 100 metric takes a simple equivalency factor and multiplies it by emissions. So the gray dots from the previous slide that were down close to the axis have now increased to over 100 megaton of CO2 equivalents per year when expressed by GWP 100. The non-methane emissions stay the same. If we add those two together, then we get the red series, which is total beef GWP 100 emissions of the US system. And so the challenge that's created with this equivalency approach is that the GWP 100 equivalence conversion does not effectively represent the temperature effects of short-lived gases like methane. Methane has an atmospheric lifetime of between 8 and 12 years. And all of the evidence that exists currently suggests that its lifetime in the atmosphere has actually decreased since pre-industrial times, from a pre-industrial lifetime of around 12 years to a current estimate of lifetime of around 8.4 years. And so because of that relatively short atmospheric life, the way that it affects temperature depends very greatly on the time horizon evaluated, and a simple factor conversion like GWP 100 tends to overestimate the warming effects of methane. And so a quote unquote better metric has been proposed, the GWP star metric. And this metric attempts to evaluate the effects of a change in the rate of methane emissions on temperature. And if you look at the panel on the right, you can see the large dashed black line represents the change in temperature or warming that results from a series of different emission scenarios, the RCP scenarios. This is the representative concentration pathways that are used to evaluate warming in greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And if you notice the kind of purple line on these panels, it's GWP star flow and stock. That emulates the warming trend most closely. The turquoise line is the GWP 100 representation or projection of temperature. And you can see that it diverges substantially from the projected warming rates. And so GWP star, when it considers both the flow and stock portions, and so the equation represented here, you see the first half of the parenthetical expression is R times a change in emissions over time times a time horizon. That represents the rate equivalent or the flow equivalent of GWP star. And then the S multiplied by the absolute emissions in a given year represents the stock effect. And so because GWP star is a more effective metric for evaluating warming, if we would like to be climate neutral, we should perhaps evaluate emissions according to this metric rather than GWP 100 for short-lived gases like methane. I'd like to point out, before I talk through this data slide, that in the recent publication, the AR6 report of IPCC, which was released early this year, they also list the GWP star metric as an acceptable metric for the assessment of effects of methane. So what I've done in this slide is transformed again. You see the gray series is always representing methane emissions, but now we're expressing those according to the GWP star metric rather than GWP 100. And you can see the substantial downshift in the warming effect or the warming equivalence. The blue line still represents the non-methane component of emissions from the US beef system. And when we add those two together, we get the green series, sort of the total warming equivalent emissions of the US beef system projected out through 2050. And as you can see in those projections beyond the current year, they oscillate a bit according to oscillations in inventory, but then stabilize at approximately 100 megaton of warming equivalents. If we compare that then to the emissions expression using GWP 100, you can see that using the more appropriate metric reduces the implied emissions factor by approximately 50%. However, it doesn't achieve neutrality just simply by changing the metric. There are a couple of opportunities that have already been discussed a bit today by which we could approach or even achieve climate neutrality. And one of those would be the mitigation of the methane component of those warming equivalent emissions. And so we can see here two different scenarios, one with an annual or year-on-year reduction of methane emissions from the US beef inventory of 0.4% or a reduction in methane emissions of 1.5% per year. And as you can see, a reduction of 1.5% per year, year on year, would in itself achieve climate neutrality by approximately the year 2037. Now, that level of reduction is perhaps difficult to achieve, although 1.5% reduction would actually be quite easy to achieve with existing technologies. To achieve that year on year for the next 30 years would imply a total reduction of methane emissions of about 35%. While that's not an impossibility, it certainly is a pretty substantial overall reduction. However, the reduction of 0.4% is quite achievable. In fact, if we considered the use of methane reducing technologies currently deployed in the finishing sector of the US beef population, which are not reflected typically in the estimation according to the EPA methodology, that level of reduction could be achieved through production practices currently in use. Another way to think about that 0.4% annual reduction is that based on heritabilities and the variance in methane emissions, daily methane emission phenotypes, it's been estimated that a 0.4% reduction is achievable through genetic selection. And so I chose that level for a couple of reasons. Those are two. But as you can see, that level, the 0.4%, doesn't quite achieve neutrality, although 1.5% would. Another potential area that has been discussed previously today towards climate neutrality would be to increase the sinks of carbon in land used for beef production. And so what I've represented here, again, the green series representing the total beef emissions without mitigation, and then the two series below representing either a 25 kilogram per grazing acre in the US reduction of carbon, or a 45 kilogram per acre reduction in carbon. And as previously, you can see that more modest mitigation step of 25 kilogram per acre does not achieve neutrality, but at 45 kilogram per acre, neutrality is achieved by the mid-2030s. Now, those two levels, just kind of for context, if we think about 25 kilograms per acre or even 45 kilograms per acre, at 25 kilogram per acre, That represents basically the creation of 1 carbon credit on 10% of the grazing acres in the US. The more ambitious mitigation path there would be effectively the creation of 1 carbon credit on 15% of the grazing acres in the US. A final way to think about these two levels is that the more ambitious mitigation pathway there represents the approximate improvement in greenhouse gas uptake projected through the century model simply from applying grazing management. And this doesn't necessarily imply a highly aggressive grazing management scenario. It implies managed versus unmanaged grazing on those landscapes. And so these mitigation levels are quite achievable. So, of course, the methane mitigation pathway and the land uptake pathway are additive. They function through different mechanisms. And so we can create combinations of these scenarios, which is what I'm showing in this particular graphic. Again, the green series represents the warming equivalent emissions of the US beef system with no mitigation. And then we see the combinations represented here. The lighter colored diamonds, the ones that approximate 0 beginning in the late 2030s, is the 25 kilogram of carbon uptake per grazing acre with 0.4% methane mitigation, down to the most ambitious, which is the combination of 45 kilogram per acre carbon uptake with 1.5% methane mitigation. And you can see that everything beyond the most modest combination there creates fairly substantial negative values for warming equivalents. So this would actually be more than climate neutral. It might be considered climate positive or even cooling. Now, one question that often comes up is, are those levels of land-based accumulation feasible, either 25 or 45 kilogram per acre? Because the rates of carbon accumulation on grazing lands really are not well defined. There's high annual variation because of the highly variable rainfall scenarios that exist on most grazing lands, especially rangelands in the western half of the United States. And the current status of those lands is somewhat of a factor in their capacity to uptake additional carbon. And so carbon sink on grazing lands is both state, in other words, what's its current status, and path, what management actions or climate regime might be in place. So they're both state and path dependent. What I'm displaying here, though, is the carbon flux or CO2 uptake on US rangeland sites over a 10-year period. These are all at USDA ARS installations across the western half of the United States, from Texas up through the Pacific Northwest. And what you can see here is a great deal of variability, and the red dots representing the mean over the time series collected at each station. If we took the average of those across all years, it's approximately 75 kilogram per acre of carbon. And so that implies that the levels of either 25 or 45 kilograms that we expressed as possible mitigation pathways are certainly well below the average expectation that we might see on Western rangelands, which would be anticipated to be on the low end of the scale of total US grazing land. That, of course, leads to another question. If, in fact, approximately 75 kilogram of carbon uptake is anticipated on US grazing lands without intervention, so those data were not comparative in the sense that they were the result of a change in practice. They were, in fact, observational studies of carbon flux. If a 75 kilogram annual uptake is a component of the grazing system already, should we apply that to the warming equivalent emissions? So this would be an inset. You might consider that, it's a current part, it's within the system boundaries. And if we applied that level of uptake across the time series, then the result would be a net warming potential for the US beef system that is substantially less than zero beginning in approximately 1985. So as we think about that, the implication of that is that beef systems may already be climate positive. A difficulty exists in the assessment of those systems. And Rory made the comment that really the data required to fully account for these things is the limitation currently. Do we have good and robust estimates of those effects? And can we reliably apply them in an assessment framework? The other thing is that are those credible claims? Because much of this component of the sustainability of beef systems, the environmentally sound component, you might say, is really a feature of the social acceptability of beef production and how it drives demand. And so as we think about the potential, and I'm going to go back to this slide, that beef systems are already climate positive. One, are we willing to make that assertion and can we defend the claim? And two, if we do this, does it inhibit or limit the ability of land managers to perhaps market or trade carbon credits? In other words, should we count these offsets internally to the system as insets to the total warming potential of the beef system? Or should we hold them separate? And if we hold them separate, then we relieve the obligation of counting the land-based credits internally and allow then those land-based credits to be traded in a different marketplace, perhaps though to the detriment of the beef production system itself, because the difficulty in achieving a climate neutral beef system without some consideration of land-based offsets. So I know I kind of went through those things pretty quickly, but I'm trying to stay on time. I'm not really famous for that capacity when I give talks. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas with everyone today.